Hello and welcome to The First Draft, a new podcast by the Foreign Policy Research Institute in which we'll examine the ideas emanating from world affairs over the next few months. I'm Robert Kaplan, Robert Strauss Houppé Chair in Geopolitics.
And I'm Dominic Green, Senior Fellow in the FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. The first draft of history that everybody has been looking at in recent weeks is the story of Russia, the Wagner Group, and the prospective disintegration, or not, of the Russian state as we know it. What do you think?
I think that there's a lot that we don't know. Reading all the reports, and particularly scanning the headlines about the Wagner Group, their aborted march to Moscow, the fact that Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, was supposed to go to Belarus in exile, but turns out to have been meeting with Putin and is in St. Petersburg. I think there's a lot of confusion and static, that there's a lot of speculation, and that the issue is really so complex because Wagner has this big skyscraper in St. Petersburg with offices as if it was the Time Life building. It has operations throughout Africa, many other places. It's involved in businesses. It's hard to disentangle Wagner from the Russian state. You just can't send the leader into exile and then take it over. Even in corporate takeovers, hostile or friendly, negotiations go on for years about this. And so I think that there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we should be humble about and just wait for things to develop. I think that one thing that's interesting is Russia historically, Dom, was a very weakly institutionalized state, especially compared to China, which is the world's oldest bureaucracy. It doesn't take much to upend Russia. After the Tsar abdicated, there was total chaos. And the result was a very iffy Bolshevik coup that ended up working and killing millions of people over the next few decades. The Russian state may be weaker than we think. And one more point before I hand it over to you is that Putin has more power than any Russian leader since Stalin. So there's nothing beneath him. It's just a black box. If he were to be challenged or something, there's very little of a bureaucratic mechanism to keep the state going.
Yeah, the typical explainer of the Wagner Group, which we hear in Western media, is that they're described as mercenaries. And I think the temptation, therefore, as you're saying, is to see them as a very small ad hoc group rather than being a quasi-state actor, some kind of hybrid form, a sort of unofficial Ministry of Defense, which is deeply tied into the regime. This is something which is unfamiliar to Western eyes. It would be very familiar to the weak, poorly institutionalized leaders of early modern Europe, which was also, of course, a golden age if you were a mercenary. So this is, I think, one example of the difficulties of interpretation, as much as difficulties of actually getting basic information about what's going on. And this was one question I want to ask you about this. The era of news that we're now in perhaps began in 1990 with the reporting of the first Gulf War. It seems now we're shifting into a different age. I've noticed most of the coverage of the war in Ukraine has come bottom up, often via social media, often by freelance journalists rather than people who are formally embedded or prior expertise even. There seems to be a vacuum in the middle zone, as it were, between the press releases we receive from governments and between this highly politicized footage that comes up. What do you think? Is there a shift in the way that we're receiving this information?
Yes, the media has totally been slowly, quietly revolutionized because it used to be all objective professionals who had no stake whatsoever in the outcome of the countries they were reporting from. In other words, the last thing they wanted in the 1980s, and I know this as a journalist in Greece in the 1980s, the last thing anyone wanted was an Arab covering the Arab world, or someone who is Jewish covering Israel. That disqualified you. They wanted people who couldn't give a hoot whether the country collapsed or tremendously succeeded. They were just there to be analysts and reporters. That's all been flipped. This professionalization has been flipped to freelancers with great linguistic ability because they tend to come from the countries that they're covering in some way or in some indirect or direct way. And therefore, they have a stake in the outcome and the emotional complexities rise. And what that leads to is you get deeper reporting in some instances, but there's a lack of objectivity or analysis in another. And that's the age that we live in now, because you can't make a living as a freelancer in the Google economy. You sell a story once, it's on Google, you can't repeat it. In the print and typewriter age, you could sell a story 50 times over. Nobody cared as long as it was in different circulation zones. So you have people who come from well-off backgrounds, or else they couldn't do this in the first place, who are tied into the areas they're covering. And so the analysis has suffered, in my opinion, in this. And this may be a factor in the coverage of the Ukraine war, where you notice everyone goes to Ukraine, reports, and comes back and says they're fighting for us. It's our battle too. That's an emotional reaction. That's not an analytical reaction.
Now, in terms of analysis, naming no names, I know you've been talking off the record with well-informed people. What is the perception then about the chances of Russia undergoing the kind of disintegration that occurred twice in the 20th century?
Higher than usual is what I would say, because as I said, weakly institutionalized, one-man rule. Remember, beneath Stalin, there was a Politburo. And when he died, it kicked into operation. There was a to-do. Some people were executed, but the system righted itself quickly. When Brezhnev and Kosygin and Podgorny replaced Khrushchev in the fall of 1964, they didn't kill him. They just they retired him, so to speak. He lived a very comfortable life up until the end. It was very institutionalized, but there's nothing like that now. You have to use your imagination. Russia has collapsed several times in its history, and it's always come back together. And a Russian collapse would mean the loss of Central Asia, the loss of the Caucasus, the loss of Tatarstan, the loss of other ethnic regions. And although it would be tremendously difficult for the Chinese to negotiate this collapse of their ally in the long run or the middle run, they would benefit from it because they would be the boss of Eurasia, essentially. And then you could have just a weak, very unstable rump, small Russian state giving permanent grief to Europe. Think of it as a low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia.
From what you're saying, a fully collapsed Russia is not in the American interest, or at least puts the United States at a disadvantage in competing with China as a patron.
Absolutely. We want Russia to lose in this war, but we don't want it to fall apart. And if we don't want it to fall apart, we may not want to remove Putin or have him removed. See, that's the thing. Everyone has become so emotionally involved in defeating Russia that they're not thinking about chess moves down the road. We want a weakened Russia, a chastised Russia, but we want a state that continues to function. And because there's no institutions and all bets are off the table, continuing to function may mean the continuation of Putin's rule.
Now, one voice who's been consistently suspicious of supporting Ukraine and alienating Russia, of course, is John J. Mearsheimer. His most recent Substack piece on this detects signs that, providing there's not some accidental and disastrous escalation, that if the Ukrainian spring offensive doesn't achieve its goals or rebalancing or victory, which is not so far what's happening, that we may now be moving towards some kind of exit strategy, period of negotiations. We're speaking in the hours after the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, at which Ukraine joining NATO was kicked very far forward. Even the British government, which has been very enthusiastic about it, said this would be well after any kind of peace settlement. In other words, it could even never happen, depending on the terms of that peace settlement. Makes some interesting arguments about how the war of attrition that the Ukrainians are in gives them a starting disadvantage that he thinks they're unlikely to overcome. And he's already therefore thinking about the post-negotiated relations. He thinks that it's almost certain that Russia will be permanently alienated from the US or the West in general. Do you think that's on the cards?
I think the Russians are already semi-permanently alienated from the US and the West in general. I think Mearsheimer has it half right, as he usually does, in the sense that, yes, it's slow going in this war of attrition for the Ukrainians. But that's because they haven't used any of their maneuver troops, which are much better armed and ready to go and are in waiting to make until there's more progress in this war of attrition. Then you could see some real breakthroughs in these maneuver brigades. Someone who's made this point, who's a real military expert, is Lawrence Friedman in Great Britain, who said this is just a phase of the spring offensive. There'll be a later phase where you will see large Ukrainian movements which could really have a breakthrough. So I'm not convinced that the Ukrainian offensive is failing. That's number one. I think it has to do with the stage of it that we're in. There was an interesting essay in Unheard written by Edward Luttwak recently. And he said the war can go on for years for the simple reason that it's a limited war. Now, we don't like to think of a war where maybe 100,000 have been killed and wounded as a limited war. But in technical terms, it could be. Nobody's using nukes or weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. has not committed any troops. This kind of warfare can just go on.
It's contained within the borders of Ukraine. It hasn't spilled.
Exactly, and that was Luttwak's point. And he said, when you have in a situation like this, don't be surprised if it goes on another 18 months, so to speak. And
that makes it a very big issue domestically as the 2024 election cycle gets going in the US. Putin has the luxury of not having to worry so much about these things.
Yeah, that's assuming he's been able to handle this Wagner issue. Now, people have said he's been weak because there was an attempted coup or something, and he hasn't really punished the perpetrators, regardless of what he said publicly using the word traitor. It may be that he has no choice, that Wagner is too complexly integrated into the whole system, that he's doing what he has to do, that necessity is driving this. And if he can come to a new understanding with Prigozhin or whatever, that Putin may not be threatened. Remember, nobody may want his job done, because whoever wants his job and gets his job may be killed shortly afterwards.
It's like being the head of a mafia clan or something.
Exactly.
It's not a long-term prospect.
So his rule may be very convenient for the people who actually might replace him, so to speak. So I think, just to sum up, we've said this before, but decades go on, nothing happens. Weeks and months go on, decades happen. We're in that latter phase right now, where the next few weeks and months can determine a lot. It's interesting, though, that Turkey seems to have been balancing more to the West lately. I think people said it's because Erdogan perceives weakness in Putin. It also may be simply that Erdogan has been reelected and can now do what he needs to do, whereas before he had to cater to the populist religious right in Turkey. So it may be a little of that as well.
Talking of preparing for the long haul, the Biden administration is said to have tipped Ursula von der Leyen, the ex-German defense minister and ex-EU minister, as the next head of NATO. I'm speaking from London this week. Noses were put out of joint here. It was felt that the British defense minister, Ben Wallace, had a very strong candidacy as an ex-soldier, and also because Britain has been so supportive of the US campaign for Ukraine. What does picking a German civilian, as it were, over a British officer, what does this suggest about the future vision of US planning in Europe?
I think this is something that you mentioned that you may want to go into, but I think the U.S. doesn't have to worry about Britain. They're an ally. They will support us in Ukraine, and therefore they can be taken for granted for some extent. Whereas Germany is much more iffy. There may be a calculation that if we get a German as NATO Secretary General, that will anchor Germany more firmly into the Western alliance and lead it to raise its defense budget and all of those good things. But I'm not so sure about that, because I think what's been keeping the German defense budget down has to do with issues and social movements in Germany itself. That's not going to matter much if von der Leyen is. What do you think about?
Well, no, and Germany has a massive surplus of euros and could quite easily have beaten its 2% GDP target on spending on military as a NATO member at any point in the last 20 years, and has had to be prodded. I think you're right that the picking Ursula von der Leyen is a carrot after all the stick that's been applied by both Trump and Biden administrations. So yes, there is a cultural objection to it in Germany. I think also, even if Germany buys US-made weapons at the rate that it says it intends to, it takes a long time to make an army and train an army. And so we're looking at well past a decade, if not 20 years, according to some German analysts, to upgrade the German military to the point at which it really would be capable of being the dominant force in Central or even parts of Eastern Europe. It's not something that can be done overnight. It had become so run down that the story goes, when von der Leyen was defense minister, that the recruits were training with broom handles because there weren't enough rifles to go around. Of course, the British are delighted when they hear this sort of thing, but they too have their own economic troubles at the moment, and so are struggling to meet or exceed that 2%. And they're also struggling to locate themselves in this position that they have got themselves into, really, of being neither Washington nor Brussels. The rapidly shifting world is shifting so fast, they really are struggling to pick an orientation or even two. And so you're right, there is this institutional habit, trusting the Americans. Americans take the British for granted. British feel peeved about it, but of course there's nothing they can really do. Meanwhile, if you look across the channel, you'll see that both France and Germany retained a commitment to keeping their economies very much oriented towards China. And I have to wonder whether that will tell in the long term more than, say, committing to buy US weapons, and whether in the long term also the British will feel that they perhaps should keep up with the neighbors rather than trust the distant patron. So yes, you can take client states for granted until, of course, they can't afford to be a client anymore. And Britain isn't quite in the situation it was in the 1970s, but it's in spectacular economic and political disarray at the moment.
Yes.
Not alone in that, of course.
There's another angle that I forgot to mention. The Biden administration may be nervous about having NATO to be seen as too much of a hawkish Anglo-Saxon enterprise, and that this would hurt Europe. But you were saying before, it takes years to build up a military in Germany. It's not just about equipment and training. It's about the civil-military relationship. In Germany, people see their troops as civil servants in funny uniforms. They don't have killer instinct. They don't have the instinct to watch their soldiers actually fight and be injured or die in the way that not just the U.S., but Britain and France, which with its imperial tradition have. The French have been, over the decades, moved troops around Africa in the most aggressive fashion, and the most snooty French intellectuals have not complained about it, because the civil-military relationship in France is different than it is in Germany.
Now, that is fascinating. You're right. And that takes even longer to change.
Yeah.
Now, we've also been watching in recent weeks events in France, which is one of the most strongly institutionalized countries I can think of.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, appears to be in a kind of social state of collapse.
Yeah. It's almost as if, it's a classic case of what's going on in a Western democracy. You have the elites who are technically, bureaucratically competent to rule, but they don't know how. It's their values that are at stake. You have this revolt of the underclass, of this broad underclass, and that drives the right wing even further in popularities. And it seems as if that France is divided between an elite, a governing elite that knows how to govern, but its values are in question, and a very angry both right-wing and left-wing underclass, which does not know how to govern, would not govern well in power, but hates the elite nevertheless.
I think this is very true. And talking of the reportage and the media angle on these things, I think a lot of accounts of it missed that both aspects, the kind of, as it were, the native white French and also the descendants of immigrants, both of them are deeply rooted in France. That unlike, say, Britain, or the French made the colonies départements of France proper. That the conflict that was brought into France was actually already, in that sense, a domestic one in the age of decolonization. And we don't actually have much hard data on this, but it's very clear that these are not people who just arrived. These are French people, French citizens who've only known life in France, who are deeply alienated from the state. So this is not comparable, say, to tensions over recent immigration into the United States or concerns over border security, which is how it tends to be played. And it's not entirely also a straightforward post-colonial dust-up where people have another round on another terrain. This is actually an internal crisis within France, which has had very many of them. And they've had 5 constitutional settlements since 1789. It's quite possible that we'll see a 6th French Republic before we'll see another Russian state.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Now we turn, of course, it's our summer episode. So what I want to know is, Robert, what is on the shelves? What is your plans for a little light summer reading?
I just finished reading Paul Theroux's latest novel about surfing in Hawaii, Under the Wave at Waimea, which is maybe about sunshine in Hawaii, but there's nothing superficial about the novel. It's the landscape descriptions are beyond compare. The characterizations are deep. The questions he's posing about aging and social responsibility are deep. I think Theroux is like a natural writer. He's so natural that we take him for granted. You never read about him in the New York Review of Books or the New York Times Book Review or the Wall Street Journal much. He's like a Jack London. He's a natural writer. Whatever he turns to, he just writes it very well and truly. And this is a very surprising, uncanny novel, which at the same time is couched within the rubric of summer reading because it flows very nicely. Another thing is perhaps Henry James's most easy to read long novel, which is The Princess Casamassima, which is about terrorism. And you would think, what does Henry James know about terrorism? This effete pseudo-American European writer. In fact, he knows a lot. He knows about how all the roots of terrorism are about personal circumstances and that the terror that have happened to the terrorists and how socially and psychologically marginal types can drift into anarchy and extreme groups. And it's just beautifully done. It's deep, it's Jamesian, but it's also one of his easier novels to read. It's not like The Ambassadors, which is
I'm very glad to hear this. I'm very glad to hear this because every summer I try and read Portrait of a Lady again and always crash after a few pages and feel disappointed. I think this time I'm just going to put that to one side and get Princess Casamassima and jump into that instead.
Yes. And my last thing is just a general recommendation. Edith Wharton, who writes about men and women better than almost anyone that I know. She was more of she's from the same age as James, late 19th, early 20th century. They were friends, both very serious classic writers. She's easier to read than he is. And I think that's why she enjoyed more commercial success in their lifetimes. But she's just absolutely, she's shrewd. That's the word I'm looking for. She's such a shrewd analyzer of character. And I particularly have in mind the novel The Reef, which is a terrible title. It's not well known, but it's her most subtle piece.
Yeah, The Reef is one of those books which is on my shelf and makes me feel guilty every time I pass it. Thanks for that. I have a couple of weighty tomes. It's always fascinating to read about the big structures of history, the cyclical flow of it. And there's a couple of books which are just coming out now, which I'm going to start with, I think, which is Neil Howe, with the idea of the fourth turning. He said it's here. That is the title of the book. The fourth turning is here. The idea that every 80 years or so, there is a major change of system. And the similar theme is explored in Peter Turchin's optimistically titled End Times. Turchin in 2010 predicted that the 2020s would see great political upheaval in the US due to this cyclical shift. And so he's now looking extremely wise indeed. And as in the old days, people tended to come up with cyclical theories of history based on ideas like the spirit of history moving through time and so on. And these days, they actually do it with numbers and graphs, which in this case is a good thing. But of course, not all heavy-duty lifting. I'm looking forward to reading Peter Andersson. He's a Swedish academic, has written the very first biography of Henry VIII's fool. Apparently, no one has done it before. Will Summer was his name. He might even be the model for the skull that is disinterred in Yorick's skull in Hamlet. Famous Tudor fool. We don't have fools in courts anymore. We have idiots, but we have no fools. So I'm looking forward to reading this because as it's wonderful when you come across a book which is set in a period you think you know about, and suddenly there's a new character and a new insight.
Thanks for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to The First Draft on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more podcasts and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.